right, guys. Our next guest is one of our favorites to chat to. You know his excellent work from Morning Combat alongside Brian Campbell on the DraftKings Network. Here to help preview UFC 300, the granddaddy of them all when it comes to MMA, as well as a couple of other things. The one and only Luke Thomas. Welcome back to Submission Radio, man. How are you?
Gentlemen, I am honored to be back. Thank you for having me. What a wonderful week this should be. Yeah,
exciting times, man. A lot to cover, a lot to get to it, a lot to get into. This is the big one, the showcase of history, the Super Bowl, the WrestleMania of the UFC 300. But obviously, cards come with a lot of criticism. You know, sort of from top to bottom, though. What do you think? Do you think this is the best card in UFC history? And if not, which would you say is? This is the debate, and I really think this debate almost has to be split up into two parts as far as like best card top to bottom, and a lot of people are arguing best pay-per-view card. Where do you stand on that, Luke?
Ooh, best pay-per-view card versus best card top to bottom. Top to bottom, it's hard to beat.
I'm not saying you have to name like the best pay-per-view or anything, but I just see a lot of people arguing and debating, and they're like, you know, UFC 299 was better, UFC 2 this and that was better. And I would argue like the pay-per-view portions of those cards might have been better. The top to bottom, maybe not so much. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the top to bottom to me is the strongest argument because the main event for this one is certainly fine. Some people might like it more than others. I don't think it's a bad main event. It's certainly debatable how good it is. But to your point, the depth of the card is great. Although I will say, I do feel like we should, I mean, this is always true, but I feel like it's very true in this case, which is we should just wait to see how this goes. And the reason why I say that is like there is a scenario where all the fights kind of work out, not necessarily as they should, but in some kind of way that is pleasing. Fights are competitive, you get finishes, it's fun all the way through. But like a card is not actually supposed to be this stacked, right? Like there are the way that cards have worked traditionally over time is that there should be a crescendo. It should build in anticipation. And of course, this one could just as well. But I mean, for example, you're getting Tsarukyan versus Oliveira in a 3-round contest. That should be a 5-round contest. I mean, it just should. Yeah. There are fights in even the return of Alexander Rakic, right? To me, that's kind of a big deal for the light heavyweight division. Winner of that might end up getting a title shot, depending kind of on how that one goes. It's also going to be the preliminary card. And so some of the things that would make some of these fights better, you actually are constraining them by putting them on this card in this like incredibly stacked way. And the lesson from UFC 200 was, yes, the Jon Jones issue falling out radically changed the top of that card. It made Amanda Nunes the main event. It made Brock Lesnar like an extra focus even beyond what he already was. At the same time, I remember the direct criticism of UFC 200 was maybe we actually shouldn't put TJ Dillashaw on the prelims. You know what I mean? Like maybe it actually doesn't make sense to do it that way. So let's see how the fights go. Wonderful fights up and down, but how they play out could play a very big role in how we remember it versus the 298s and 299s of the world.
UFC 205 was crazy strong as well. If you go back and look at that top to bottom, I think with UFC 205, the pay-per-view portion arguably had the more, I don't know if intriguing matchups, but the thing that I think is missing from 300, phenomenal card. I think you can make the argument the top to bottom, prelims to main event, it might be the best card, but I just think it's missing those fights or that fight where you're just like, dude, I can't be anywhere else but here watching this right now. Like Volkanovski and Topuria, or Volkanovski and Islam, or, you know, even O'Malley and Cheeto, or Strickland and DDP, or like Israel and Strickland to some degree. Like those are all fights where you're like, dude, I'm fucking watching this live. There's no way I'm going to miss this. You know, whereas some of these fights, they're going to be phenomenal fights, but it's like, you know, we'll get into it later, but it's like Gaethje and Holloway, phenomenal fight, fighting for a nothing belt, you know? Zhang Weili and Jan Zhang, this is the one thing that I want to ask you about. Why do you think this is on there? Because this is where a lot of the criticism first started, and people initially thought, all right, they'll put this up there, but they're going to add us, you know, all these other things. And they tried, you know? It was probably going to be Israel and DDP. It was probably going to be a whole bunch of other things. It didn't work out. Why do you think they've stuck this on there? This feels like it could be on another card. I know that obviously like Weili and Yan, the first two Chinese women fighting for UFC belt, it is historic in its own right. It's just that a lot of you know casual fans, they don't know who Yan is, even though she is deserving, and so they won't know the you know the story here. Do you think they're trying to capture the enormous Chinese market? Like when, movies put John Cena in them, Hollywood puts John Cena in their movies. What do you think they're trying to do here, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, usually when a fight like this doesn't feel quite in place, there's a few reasons. I mean, going back to what you said before, it's like, I'm not saying that MMA or UFC doesn't currently have big fights, but to your point, the UFC 300, for example, the main event of UFC 100 was a grudge match and a rematch between Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir. It was a big fight, and it was the thing where the fight game was building towards that over time. You don't have that necessarily with this one. UFC 200, again, was supposed to be DC and Jon Jones. Same kind of thing, but at least very similar, and it got changed out at the last minute, right? So that you ended up with something a little bit different. That is a fair criticism of the UFC 300 card, that these are big names and these are fights of consequence, but there isn't exactly like these two guys who have been on a collision course together, orbiting one another. There isn't exactly that. In the case of Zhang Weili in this one, so there's a few factors. One might be that they wanted to keep this belt in rotation at this time. Another one was maybe at the time in which they were booking it, they wanted some insurance about what was available to them, right? They didn't know if Leon Edwards was going to be available. They didn't know if Izzy was going to be, or DDP, I should say, actually. Or even then, we didn't know if DDP was going to be the guy either. We didn't know who was going to be available on that middleweight slot. So partly it could be insurance. Another one could be that they want to promote the winner and take them and then parade them in a show in China, should they, and I'm sure it will inevitably return to that place. So that's there as well. The other one could be if they didn't put it here, they want to save it for whatever China show that they have planned. And that from a calendar perspective, they just needed to get it in rotation. Any of those factors are typically reasons that you can look to when a fight is on a card, and it's perfectly fine, but it doesn't necessarily fit it in the most obvious way.
I know that you mentioned briefly Jon Jones earlier because UFC 200, that didn't work out for him. And just quickly, I know we're jumping all over the place. Before we get back to this card, it just sort of got me thinking a little bit. We've had some more Jon Jones breaking news just a couple of days ago. He has a new recent situation as police were involved after a drug test official felt threatened when Jones allegedly took her phone during a visit to his home. Jones claimed he was drinking while celebrating a friend's birthday and that everything ended amicably. And he showed a video of him giving her a high five, which is available on his Instagram. Gotta ask, man, like as you sort of mentioned Jon Jones earlier, what do you make of this thing, and how does it sort of fall into this whole evolving Jon Jones, I guess, legacy where we don't know when he'll be back, but things just keep sort of stacking up in the wrong direction as it goes along more and more?
This is the basic take, I think, from this. Remember something. Jon has responded to a degree. He put out a very short snippet of a video on his Instagram page. He put out a message along with it, accusing the doping control officer, the DCO in this particular case, of being unprofessional, and that everything ended ultimately amicably. We don't actually have a full set of facts. We don't have enough evidence to pour over to really exactly know what the full story is. But just break it down piece by piece. Jon Jones having issues with anti-doping authorities, again, alleged in this incident. That's something that we know he's had in the past. Jon Jones drinking in the middle of the afternoon, I don't think by itself is a big deal, but recall that he has had many issues related to substance abuse, to say nothing of the September 2021 arrest when he was banging his head on the front of a cop car, and or folks forget about this. He was arrested during the pandemic for shooting off guns in downtown Albuquerque, and he had a bottle of Recuerdo in his vehicle at the time. So that matches up to something he's done previously. Having issues with anti-doping authorities and law enforcement. You can all see, again, that's alleged in this case, but we know for a fact he's had that in the past. He is alleged to have threatened a woman here. Don't know if that's a fact, but we know there was an incident, again, going back to September 2021 with his then fiance in a Vegas hotel room where she was reportedly having blood on her face, and apparently, again, according to reports that came out at that time, that he had potentially struck her. So it's like, we don't know exactly what the facts are, but all of them match scenarios that we do know have happened in a previous extent at a previous time in his career. And it's like, guys, I'll just speak personally about this. I'm the last guy on earth who can really ever criticize anyone else for drinking. I did a lot of drinking in my life, a lot of it. Like, I mean, I make a joke about it, but I did it to a degree that was really unhealthy. I've had incidents. I've never had law enforcement trouble, but I've personal health problems or, any of the other complications that come with substance abuse. I've had them. I've had them all. But like, dude, if you're now closer to 40 than you are 30, and you're still in the middle of that, catastrophe is coming. I just don't know how else to tell you that. Like, any number of ways in which you don't manage risk properly at any age, 18, 30, 50 to 70, it doesn't matter, right? So it can affect you in every kind of way. But what I can tell you is the problems and how difficult they are to account for and solve for when you start to get to 40, it becomes much, much more difficult, even if you do have significant financial or legal resources to protect you. Obviously, that makes a difference as well. But if nothing changes, at some point, catastrophe is inevitable. I really hope that doesn't happen for his sake and for his family's sake. I truly mean that. I mean, I find him to be not a very sympathetic character, but I don't wish trauma on anybody. But it just seems like there's like, if what has happened in a microcosm mirrors everything that has happened before, doesn't really give you a sense that there's anything really fundamentally changing about his condition other than age. And if that's the case, it doesn't look great for any kind of promising future, but I guess we shall see.
Yeah, it's a tough one because, like, when you think about the situation with his wife, he spoke about how, like, his brain and body can't handle alcohol anymore, and he's going to stop and he's going to change himself, and this is going to be the best thing that happened to him. And then it keeps sort of repeating itself. And like you, look, I like to have fun. I like to party as well. So, like, and if he's celebrating a person's birthday, it's not an issue in any way whatsoever. It's more the fact that there's been constant promises and things keep happening. And then there's the dash cam footage from however long ago where, Jon Jones was arrested and banging his head. And it's like, you can see the roller coaster of emotions that seems to happen in any of those situations. And then what was the other one? There was one who was heckling the comedian. I think around the time
I forgot about that.
Yes. And that was like a sad video to watch, because you can see again, like, all that roller coaster of emotions. You suck. No, you're great. No, you suck. No, I love you, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. Like you mentioned, we don't have the facts. We don't know what really happened. We don't know if this was something legit or if it was just, a Karen complaining. We have no idea. I don't think it's going to affect anything anyway. I think we'll be excited for Jon Jones' return in however many months against Stipe Miocic.
Yeah, you used to get drunk and steal sandwiches from Walmart, so I don't know what you're talking about. You're a fun person to be around.
Listen.
And by the way, when we come back to America, I hope you get drunk again, because I'm hungry, man. I like those sandwiches.
Yeah. Well, I've turned into the hangovers now have become like, it's hard to overstate how bad they are at age 44. But like, here's the thing, like, heckling comedians, I've never done that, but I've done, like, obnoxious public a-hole behavior when I've been drunk. It's just, at 36, it's like, dude, you're too old to be doing this. You have way too much to lose to be doing this. So it's not like I can say, oh, I've done so much better. I've not. But like, I remember around 37, 38, I began to get I never had as much to lose again as him. But like, dude, I can't believe how much I drank and never had a law enforcement issue. Imagine how many times he's had a law enforcement issue and or some kind of doping control issue, and it ends up in some kind of like very unusual, very negative place. It's like, dude, if you're doing that much worse and I did that much drinking, so something has to be going very wrong on the calculus and execution side of whatever it is he's doing with his life, because that, like, this routine level of issue, it only happens when someone is just not managing their affairs properly. But again, to the specificities of this situation, there's still a lot to learn.
Yeah, 100%. Hey, just back on UFC 300, I am curious, man, what fight are you actually looking forward to the most? Which is the one that you're like, maybe the story isn't there, or maybe it is, but for whatever reason, you're looking forward to it the most?
I got to tell you, two answers, but really just one. Very quickly, I would just say, I think most people feel like the fun quotient is the Holloway Gaethje BMF belt. Again, whether that fight should be made, is a debate.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that fight belongs for the BMF belt, or should Max be now focusing on Topuria, because I guess Volk's not going to get the immediate rematch according to some preliminary reports. There's a lot of different ways to look at that fight and say, you can have some critique of it. But now that it's going to happen, it seems like it's going to be very, very fun, like super fun. So take that for what it's worth. But for me, it's got to be the Tsarukyan Oliveira fight. I mean, just far and away, that's the one that I care about the most. All respect to all the other champions or former champions on this card. There's a lot to pick from in terms of what you like. But the Tsarukyan one is interesting to me. A guy still in his 20s, getting better rapidly, but I think still a lot of questions. He's a fairly sizable-ish favorite heading into this one with a guy in Oliveira who's just got some of the most dynamic offense we've ever seen, not just in this division, but in the UFC altogether. And it's just massive stakes, massive consequence, one of your best divisions. The fact that it's 3 versus 5 doesn't fill me with joy, but that we're getting it certainly does. I don't know how it's going to fit into what Dustin Poirier has been tweeting today, which is he looks like he's going to be next for Islam Makhachev. I don't know how that's going to work, but those 3 rounds, should it go that long, should be magic. Really, really, really fun and important fight. I love it.
It's very much important for the division in terms of like the old guard sort of, Charles versus Arman. Arman's like young. He's got so much momentum. He's got so much confidence. And I think being on 300, if they are leading to that eventual and maybe inevitable rematch with Islam, him being on 300 and having this kind of spot to showcase against Oliveira is phenomenal. And, if Oliveira wins, then, you can say somewhat the same thing, even though Oliveira is already a more established name. But just since you've brought that up, how do you think they actually match up? Like, Oliveira comes one way, and that is forward pressure. His pressure is insane. In close, his elbows, his knees are devastating. But we saw Arman's vicious clinch game just recently against Beneil, man. The man has some of the best wrestling in the division as well. Charles has submissions for days. Like I mentioned, Arman's young and full of confidence. Maybe the future. What are you expecting between these two in those 3 rounds?
I think it's a great question. I really believe that, Makhachev, if Makhachev fought Oliveira again, I do think that there's reason to believe a second fight could look a little bit different. But in the end, I would favor him to win because I think the nature of his game and the predisposition that he has, both in terms of how he grapples, but more importantly, just how offensively patient he is. That was really the antidote, and it worked quite well, obviously, as we all now have seen. I think this is going to be a gigantic test of Arman Tsarukyan's fight IQ. Not so much his ability, although partly that too, but more so fight IQ. Charles Oliveira has a really, really strong ability to pull you into his game, and then force mistakes along the way. Trevor Whitman has been very clear. Really, when you get 2 people who are very talented, they might have different strengths and weaknesses, but they're both about as good as one another. But what the difference can be, who really makes the first mistake, or if it comes to it, who makes more mistakes. You mentioned the clinch game. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think Arman Tsarukyan's clinch is underrated. I'm not saying it's as good as Oliveira's, but when I think about how they size up, who wins some of those battles is actually going to be pretty consequential. Obviously, that fight could take place on the feet. I think that the defense of Tsarukyan, the Joaquim Silva fight, somewhat notwithstanding, has gotten better. But really, when you think about where this fight is likeliest to happen, it's likeliest to happen on the ground. It could go the other ways, but I think it's going to happen on the ground. And so what you really have to ask yourself is, who has Tsarukyan faced that is a submission threat in the way that Charles Oliveira is? And the answer is nobody. In fact, I went and looked at Arman Tsarukyan's record. Pop quiz. How many times has someone attempted a submission on Arman Tsarukyan in the entirety of his UFC career? The answer is 0. It's never happened. Guys have tried a couple of times, but not gotten very close. The closest is Davi Hamosh, who is also a very decorated grappler, but a bit of a tree stump, has a much smaller body type and game. And here's the difference. He would frame for an armbar and twist underneath, wouldn't get it, and then would recapture guard, and then Tsarukyan would go into ground and pound. That is not what happens with Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira might frame for something. He might go for deep half. And if it doesn't work, then he's going to frame on your chest, and then he's going to invert and try to go for outside Ashigarami. He might invert and go to the back. There's a lot of things, or he might do reverse De La Hivo. These are all kinds of leg entanglements where he then pulls you in. If you want to see a great example, 2 fights Charles Oliveira versus Kevin Lee, Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler, where they would frame out, and the instant they would do that, his legs start going in, and he does his Spider-Man game where, again, all of these different guards he's playing, and then he begins this cycle of pulling you into his game, making you make mistakes, blah, 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 and it goes on from there. The question is, what answer for that Arman Tsarukyan's going to have? That, to me, is the fault line here about once he starts his inversion, once he starts his reaping, once he starts his outside Ashigarami, when all that stuff gets going, now what do you do? Are you going to end up with him on your back, or are you going to end up in a different situation where you pull back out, you go for a different takedown, or are you going to do what Islam did? I'm going to wait to tag this guy before I really make an effort to follow him to the ground, and then that way I'm going to put myself on advantageous grappling terms. Tsarukyan hasn't really done that kind of thing to date, but at the age at which he's at, this is when these guys are showing sometimes the very best versions of themselves. Dude, what a fight. What a fight this is. I can't wait.
Man, incredible. I know we spoke briefly on the BMF title fight, so I got to go into it right now. How do you think Max does this time at 155, Max Holloway, after losing last time to Dustin back in 2019? Do you think he redeems himself, or do you think Justin Gaethje might finally sort of break him like he did Tony Ferguson?
So it's a risky fight for Max. I mean, you're just fighting a punisher in Justin Gaethje. There's just no two ways about it. Let me say this, gun to my head, I think like most people, I would give the nod to Justin Gaethje, gun to my head. But let me just say this, and of course, listen, here I am going to make a slight case for Max. And it could be the case where he goes in there and for the first time gets knocked out, and here I am looking like another asshole on submission radio. So I'm hoping not to do that. I'm hoping not to do it. But here's what I want to say. I do think that people are who might be worried about Max, or again feel like Justin has, let's say, the wind at his back in this matchup. No issue with that. I think it's very fair. But let me just say two things. One, I know Max's previous manager, and I've had a lot of conversations about how weight fluctuations, were kind of hard for him to manage, and the lessons that they learned. I feel like his bulk to 155 this time will be better than the one he had against Dustin Poirier. It's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is I hear a lot about people being like, oh, he doesn't deal well with leg kicks. And I'm like, are you sure about that? He defeated Jose Aldo twice. By the way, one of the best leg kickers ever, and did it circling one direction one time. And I did a whole Monday Morning Analyst series on that. And then the second time he fought Jose Aldo, he circled the other way. And why did he do that? Because he wanted to turn Aldo constantly. And by turning him, he was able to minimize some of the impact from that. So I'm not saying there haven't been other leg kickers who have had various forms of success against him. But if Max has stopped one of the best leg kickers in MMA history twice with strikes, you have to count that as well. He does have some of the ingredients, I think, to mitigate some of the effects of that. And the last thing I'd say is, dude, Max is historically resilient. We all know at some point that train is going to come to a stop. And this, in fact, could be it, to your point. If it did, I'd be like, right. I guess he was due. On the other hand, Max's resilience and his jab and his work rate, I feel like for over 5 rounds gives him some very unique opportunities. And the last thing I would say is, again, gun to my head, I think Justin wins. But Justin has made a choice in his career where he's going to work on his takedown defense, scrambling, and obviously his striking has come so far. It's incredible. On the other hand, once you get to the ground, that's just really not where he shines. And we've seen that with only the guys who could take him there. And I'm not necessarily saying Max is, but he got dropped with a shot by Oliveira and he scooped to the back. What I'm pointing out to you is, if there is a scenario where Max can make him work and he does get tired and he does get dropped or rocked or whatever, we have seen that Max actually does have some kind of ability on the ground. You saw that in the Yair Rodriguez fight. Some of this might sound like a pipe dream. I'm just trying to put together a composite picture that doesn't necessarily make me say that Max is going to win, but it does make me say, I think some of the people being like, oh, well, he's just walking to his doom. That's a risk. But I think people are short selling him a little bit too easily, and I hope they reconsider the broader context of Max's career. And I think there's reasons for some optimism here.
100%, man. I want to talk about Kayla and Kayla Harrison and Holly Holm, but just quickly before we do, a reminder: this episode is brought to you by Manscaped. And did you know that one man every hour, every day is diagnosed with testicular cancer? In fact, the testicular cancer is the most common form of cancer amongst men aged 15 to 35. With April being National Testicular Cancer Awareness Month, our friends at Manscaped have partnered with the Testicular Cancer Society to help spread awareness for men's health and early cancer detection. Visit manscaped.com/TCS to learn how to check yourself for early signs of cancer. And of course, you can always use the promo code submission for 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com. With that in mind, you can perform simple routine self-checks at home while enjoying Manscaped products you use every single day, like the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. Makes sense. We use products daily to trim and maintain our boys down there. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra features 2 interchangeable skin-safe blade heads, a standard one for taking a little off the top, and a new foil blade to go smooth and sleek. You've got the dual LED spotlights. You've got the fact that it's waterproof and the travel lock feature, so you don't have any embarrassing moments at the airport. Don't forget to pick up some phenomenal Manscaped goods at manscaped.com. Use the code submission for 20% off. Isn't that right, Dennis?
That's right, man. And while you're doing that, why not jump on NordVPN? NordVPN sponsors Submission Radio and is giving you guys an amazing deal where you get 4 extra months on the 2-year plan for free. That's right. Try it risk-free right now with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Go to nordvpn.com/submission. NordVPN is absolutely essential when it comes to me and Cass, but when it comes to protecting our privacy when we're online, things like your bank details, passwords, online identity, you can change location so you can watch different content from all of your different streaming services. Geo-block content as well here in Australia is a real issue. No more thanks to NordVPN. The threat protection feature protects you from viruses, malicious malware, and phishing sites. And it's the fastest VPN in the world. No buffering or lagging while streaming. Stops your ISP bandwidth throttling. Of course, you guys can use one NordVPN account across 6 devices. One NordVPN account across 6 devices. That's unbelievable, and it has one of the best apps in the game. So go to nordvpn.com/submission. Try it risk-free today with a 30-day money-back guarantee and get that special deal. Save some money and change your life forever at a price of a cup of coffee per month, Cass.
There you go. Luke, just going back to things, man, I mentioned Holm and Kayla Harrison. A historic fight in its own right, or should I say like a storyline fight. Obviously, Holm famously beating Ronda Rousey. Now she's got another judoka coming into 135. How important do you think this is for the bantamweight division? Because let's just be honest, 135 is a bit of a disaster at the moment. Nobody really cares about it after that last title fight. But this fight has probably more intrigue than any other title fight that could be made in the division currently. And it sets up Kayla as like a possible star if she can become champion, or even Holm for that matter, who has been obviously chasing that belt ever since she lost it in, 2015. She's got that the casual fan name value from beating Ronda back in 2015. I guess the most interesting part is the cut to 135 for Kayla. What are you expecting here?
I mean, you're underselling that cut. I mean, I'm sure you guys have interviewed her a million times. I've interviewed her before many times, had her in studio many times. I remember the first time I had her in studio, I could not believe how muscled she was. And granted, she wasn't cutting weight or anything, and this was years and years ago. But I did an interview with her, I think I want to say 2018, 2019, something like that, when she was obviously still with PFL. And she was rightly disdainful of weight cutting and how bad it was for you. And for folks who may not understand this, she competed in the 170s in judo, the 170s. And, she's the most decorated Olympic judoka in American history, male or female. And now they wanted to get to the 135. Like, I cannot overstate this. I'm not saying she won't make it. She's such a pro and like a maniac in that way that she probably will make it. But like, what's going to be left of her? Fuck if I know, honestly. This will be one of the most like difficult weight cuts, not merely on this card, but of anyone trying to get to another weight class in UFC right now, for anybody. Like, I don't know anyone else off the top of my head who's trying to do to their body what Kayla is to make their weight class. This is going to be a Herculean effort on her parts, and I think it will substantially affect her performance. That's not to say, well, she will lose. In fact, I think she will win. But that is first and foremost. I mean, Friday's weigh-ins are going to be interesting. Let's put it that way. So, but putting that aside, I hate giving oxygen to this view, even if it's my own view. And what I mean by that is, like, there's so many people in MMA that clearly have issues with women, that are clearly got retrograde ideas, that clearly have mom issues. I mean, the amount of dudes in this space with mom issues is like astronomically high. Yeah. But I bring this all up to say, I do think there is merit to the idea. Dude, you mentioned women's bantamweight's not hot. Women's MMA is not that hot right now. Granted, it's getting a lot better in terms of like the wrestling has caught up a long way. There is some turnover happening in a couple of interesting places. Obviously, standouts like Shevchenko and Grasso, it's great, no complaints. They're elite, they're amazing. But like, there's not a lot of interesting storylines, and there's not a lot of rivalries. And like, when you think about like fight of the year performances, granted, we're only a quarter in of the way of the year. Like, how many of them are women's fights that stand out to you? For the most part, it's the men's fights that have stood out. And I have to assure people, this is not the way it's always been, not even close. It just feels like that's where we are right now. And I don't have a great explanation for it. I'm sure there's many factors that go into it. But to answer your question, for Kayla Harrison, if she can beat this weight cut and then go out there and really stick it to Holm and become this kind of face that the UFC can really rally behind, that's not even what 135 needs. That's just what the entire women's side of the game needs. They need a face. They need a story. They need a Caitlin Clark. I don't know if you guys in Australia are paying attention to this. Yeah. They need somebody who comes in there and takes the game by the scruff of the neck and makes you look at it. And no one on the women's side of the game, again, with a couple of exceptions here or there, is really doing that right now. The weight cut is going to make that harder, but there is obviously a lot that's possible given a strong outcome for her.
Clark, 12 million viewers on a college basketball game. Absolutely. 14 million. Absolutely. Dude, unbelievable.
It beat every game of basketball, male or female, college or pro, on ESPN ever. Think about that for a second.
I love to see it, man. But the thing here is, before we move off it, I'm not a big fan of this whole thing because, number one, it's buried away in the prelims. I feel like with Harrison, why not build it up? Why not make it a separate event? There's not many big fights. I'd put it on a pay-per-view somewhere in the co-main and really build that story, like you said. And number two, why risk this whole weight cut when you have a potential star that you can sort of build around? Potentially look at other ways to promote it. I just think it's a bit of a waste. And number three, it gets lost in this card. Not enough time to talk about it. Not enough story to really explain how big it is. Going to be a lot of casual fans who don't really know who she is. It's a bit of a disappointment. Anyway, let's talk about the main event. Alex versus Jamahal. How would you compare? Let's get right into it, man, because a lot of people are talking about the striking here, about how the fact, Alex Pereira, one of the best strikers in MMA. How do you compare their striking and Jamal's chances here? A lot of people are looking at the pedigree of Pereira, his insane power. And if we ask Jamahal, though, his entire base being MMA makes him a different striker and even gives him an advantage. He also shocked a lot of people against Glover Teixeira. How do you see these two sort of mixing it up?
So I'm not nearly as dismissive of Jamal's chances that a lot of people are. I mean, Jamal goes to battle with people on Twitter, and then, everyone or a lot of people get mad at him and they troll him and they get a rise out of him. And, so I don't know if he's making like a lot of friends that way necessarily, but like if you just separate from that, if you separate from Bart Simpson calling Mo at the bar to ask him to speak to IP freely, it's like, dude, you look at Jamal's game, it's understand what I'm saying. It's simple, but it's not easy to deal with, not even a little bit. So like, to me, there's a lot of differences. Grappling is probably going to be neither of their like go-tos, but from what I saw in the Teixeira fight, at least the defensive grappling of Jamal looks a lot better than what I've seen from Alex. But he's been cross-training a lot at this point, so I guess we'll have to see. I don't know if he's going to go for the takedowns. I guess we'll see on that. I doubt it. It's probably going to be, striking it out, boomer. Either that works or it doesn't. I don't know. There's going to be a lot of like mixing of the martial arts here. But if we're talking about the way in which they compare, I would bring up two basic points. I would say one, if you look at someone like Pereira, he is a bit of a bouncer, not like the guy who checks your ID, but like he is constantly bouncing up and down, right?
He could be. He's got the facial expression for it.
Yeah, exactly. He could be one of those too.
Not getting in the octagon in those shoes.
Yeah. So what I mean to say is he's not someone like Jamal is a step and slider, right? He's a little more rooted to the ground. That's why partly he's got a little bit more power. Now Alex can root himself as well. I mean, his left hook is quite vaunted at this point. But the leg kicking is going to be the big part. I mean, to me, it's like you've got Jamal who's going to be rooted to the ground more commonly. He's probably going to be to an extent, the question is who's going to press the action here. I'm going to guess it's going to be Jamahal a little bit more. And he's got good boxing. He's got good reach. He's got good reads. He's got good, as I mentioned, good power. He's got some decent combinations at time. He can do a lot with that. The question is what he's got as an answer for the leg kick. I don't really know what that would be. I've not seen dynamic leg kicking defense from him to this point, so that'll be an interesting one. But again, if you can turn a guy like Pereira, if you can kind of make him go backwards, it makes it somewhat nullified, somewhat. And the other one, of course, I think is obviously you're going to deal with his left hook. We'll have to see what kind of role that plays. I doubt to me, it's going to be the leg kicking is really like what is going to be Jamahal Hill's answer for something like that. I don't really know. But let me just say this. We're talking about the weight cut with Kayla. Fully healthy Jamahal Hill, fully healthy Alex Pereira is an interesting fight. I don't know if we're getting that. I mean, that devastating Achilles injury he had is really, and the timeline at which he returned. And remember, he was doing an interview, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we made the deal today," and it was like a month away from the fight. And it's like, it's one thing to ask me how do their styles compare. It's another thing to ask me how do they compare when Jamahal has been returning on what appears to be an expedited timeline. And so there's a little bit of me. I mean, certainly I don't have any medical info or an ability to make any kind of diagnosis here. I don't know. But I think it'd be foolish to look the other way and say, here's a guy who might be getting leg kicked a lot, who might be having to do a lot of, really difficult movement to track down a guy. I guess we'll have to see about that. And if that's the case, and his injury is still somewhat vulnerable, what does that mean for his ability to compete? I guess we're going to find out.
It's going to be crazy, man. And just on like a side note, and just to end on a somewhat positive note, how good for Alex Pereira from going from like an unknown guy to most MMA fans, other than for his wins over Israel Adesanya, and really an outsider of the sport kind of coming in for almost one reason, to going into just having a phenomenal career in the UFC, beating Israel, being a middleweight champion, now a light heavyweight champion, dual weight champion, something that almost nobody ever does, and doing it in such a short time span, and now headlining one of the most historic cards in UFC history, in UFC 300. You just got to be happy for the guy, man. It's definitely a feel good story.
He doesn't have to do the same that crazy weight cut to middleweight, at least.
Still
right.
Yeah.
and has become one of the most fan favorite fighters by saying almost no words. How crazy is that?
You have to love it. It's so enjoyable to not hear some loudmouth constantly just badgering us with their, often just their political takes, but then beyond that, like their terrible jokes. And here he comes in there looking like, remember you guys seen Breaking Bad and the two twins who come in with the bald
Mexican
head?
Guys? Yeah.
He's like both of those guys put together. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's just one of them. He's like two of them in a trench coat, like trying to go to the movies.
Yeah. Great reference.
So to have a guy like that come in, but it also just sort of goes to show you, obviously he's got an incredible story, an incredible look to a degree, right? And this incredible background and an incredible skill set. All of it works to his advantages. Plus, 185 and 205, somewhat more wide open than 135 and 145. But nevertheless, the UFC saw him in a really elevated position, and then he made good on those promises. You have to kind of be somebody that the UFC can identify as somebody that they even want to give these opportunities to. So it's not to undermine what he's done. It's amazing, but it is to say, like, has there been a little bit of a halo that's been put upon him by the UFC to even grant these opportunities? Yes, he made the most of it, but not everyone gets those shots,
Yeah. I gotta run. I gotta get on the road. But as we wrap up, follow the man at L Thomas News on Twitter and Luke Thomas News on IG. Check out Morning Combat and all of their amazing coverage leading into UFC 300. Now on DraftKings Network, right? And you've got the YouTube channel is back. It's officially back, Luke.
It's back. It's back. So that was the big thing that was holding us up. I know you got to go. The big thing holding us up was when you go from one company to another and you take the IP with you, it just doesn't happen automatically. But we have it, episode 2, 11 a.m. in the East, 11 a.m. New York City time on Monday. It will be live on YouTube worldwide for everybody.
Dude,
well,
phenomenal.
Congratulations.
Happy for you, boys.
Thank you.
Guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you so much, Luke. Always love chatting with you. Have a phenomenal one. Look forward to the coverage from you and BC.
Same. Thank you, guys.